Ever woken up to find your backyard turned into a giant bubble bath? Well, I did, thanks to an HOA Karen with way too much free time. Ever since I can remember, living in our little suburban neighborhood has been an exercise in tolerating the eccentricities of our self-appointed enforcers. But nothing could have prepared me for the day when I discovered my backyard had turned into a Sudsy disaster zone, a bubble bath that had taken on a life of its own. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. I was still half asleep when I wandered outside for my usual cup of coffee and was greeted by a sight so surreal that I questioned whether I was still dreaming. My pool, usually a crystal-clear oasis, was overflowing with thousands of bubbles that tumbled over the edge in a foamy cascade, spilling onto my deck and creeping toward my lawn. At first, I thought I might have done something stupid. Maybe I'd left the chlorine tablets in too long or mixed up some chemicals, but as I looked closer, I realized the suds were not natural at all. They had a distinct, almost industrial quality, and there were unmistakable streaks of a white residue running along the pavement. I quickly grabbed my phone and checked the security footage, and there she was, Karen. Not just any Karen, but the notorious HOA Karen who had taken it upon herself to enforce a rigid set of neighborhood rules that, frankly, made little sense. With a haughty air and an almost ritualistic precision, she had been pouring an entire box of industrial-strength detergent into my pool. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. The video captured every moment, Karen's determined expression as she shook the empty container over the water, ensuring that every last grain of soap was dissolved into what used to be my pristine backyard oasis. In that moment, a fresh wave of anger and disbelief surged through me. This wasn't the first time Karen had overstepped her bounds. In fact, she had been harassing me for months with bogus HOA violations. She had complained about everything from the wrong shade of my patio furniture to my non-conforming mailbox design and even the natural state of my lawn. And as if to prove a point, she decided that my pool needed a lesson in what she considered proper community standards. Later that day, the tension reached a boiling point at our monthly HOA meeting. I still remember the stifling air of the community center, where rows of folding chairs were filled with residents who looked both resigned and frustrated, almost like they were prisoners in a never-ending trial of petty regulations. Karen, standing at the front like a queen in her court, was addressing the crowd with her usual air of unyielding authority. When I raised my hand to ask a question, her sigh seemed to echo through the room. "Yes, Jake," she drawled, as if she were doing me a favor by even acknowledging my presence. With a steady voice, I held up my phone and asked, "Would you say that dumping industrial-strength detergent into someone's personal pool qualifies as a violation of any rule?" A murmur ran through the crowd, and I could see that even the most loyal supporters of Karen were beginning to doubt her narrative. With a dismissive hand wave and a rehearsed smile, Karen tried to justify her actions as an effort to maintain neighborhood cleanliness, suggesting that perhaps my pool had been a long-standing issue. I couldn't help but notice the subtle twitch in her fingers as she clutched her clipboard, a tiny hint that maybe her confidence was faltering. It was at that moment that my best friend, Matt, leaned over and whispered an idea that would change everything. "If you drain that pool, all that soapy water has to go somewhere," he murmured with a mischievous glint in his eye. I stared at him, processing the suggestion. It was daring, it was bold, and it was exactly the kind of revenge that my simmering frustration demanded. I decided then and there that if Karen wanted to play dirty, I would play dirty too, but with style. The plan was simple, yet brilliantly calculated. I would drain my pool overnight, directing the foamy torrent onto Karen's meticulously manicured lawn, the very lawn she had boasted about winning awards for year after year. That night, under the cover of darkness, I set the plan into motion. I positioned a garden hose carefully from my pool toward Karen's front yard. The water trickled steadily, not enough to raise immediate alarm, but enough to slowly saturate her prized flower beds and lawns. I sat outside with Matt, both of us watching the transformation with a mix of apprehension and excitement. The quiet hum of the water draining felt almost meditative, punctuated by our occasional nervous laughter and whispered predictions of what the next morning would bring. The dawn broke with an almost surreal calm before the storm. When I finally roused from sleep and peeked out my window, I was greeted by chaos. The entire street had been transformed into a scene straight out of a slapstick comedy. Foam was spilling over, cascading down from Karen's lawn and onto the sidewalks. I could see children from the neighborhood already out and about, laughing and jumping into the thick, sudsy mess as if it were a giant, frothy playground. And there, in the center of it all, stood Karen. Her perfectly styled blonde bob was disheveled by panic, and her once pristine lawn was now a patchwork of soap and water. Her face turned a deep shade of red as she stormed out of her house, arms flailing wildly, and began shouting at anyone within earshot. I stepped outside, trying to contain my own grin as Karen shouted accusations of destruction, claiming that I had deliberately drenched her property with soapy water. I maintained a cool, neutral expression, replying calmly that I had merely drained my pool and that gravity, not malice, had determined the water's path. The neighborhood, which had been quietly watching from their windows and doorways, began to murmur and exchange amused glances. Even Matt, standing beside me with barely contained laughter, couldn't help but comment on the poetic nature of the event. "Karma's a funny thing, isn't it?" he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Not long after the initial commotion, the local city inspector arrived on the scene. He was a middle-aged man who seemed to have seen it all, and as he took in the scene, the soapy chaos spreading onto multiple yards and the incredulous expressions on our neighbors' faces, he let out a long, exasperated sigh. Karen, still fuming, pointed an accusing finger in my direction, demanding that I be held accountable for what she called destruction of property. The inspector listened patiently as she ranted, but his expression remained largely unimpressed. After all, there was technically no ordinance against draining pool water onto a neighbor's property, however messy the results might be. As he jotted down notes, Matt couldn't resist making a few more lighthearted comments about the absurdity of the situation. Then, just when it seemed like the day couldn't get any more dramatic, a surprising twist unfolded. While Karen ranted about the injustice of it all, Matt pulled out his phone and showed me a set of documents that would turn the entire neighborhood dynamic on its head. It turned out that Karen, the very person who prided herself on enforcing rules and maintaining order, had been hiding a much darker secret. For years, she had been illegally siphoning water from the city's supply to irrigate her own garden, a fact that had gone unnoticed until now. I remember my heart pounding as I scrolled through property records, water usage reports, and even several neighborhood complaints that all pointed to one undeniable conclusion: Karen had been diverting city water illegally for nearly a decade, racking up an astronomical bill that she never intended to pay. With the inspector now reviewing the evidence on Matt's phone, Karen's facade began to crumble before our very eyes. Her smug confidence gave way to panic as the official, brow furrowed and voice growing sterner, informed her that her illegal siphoning was not only a breach of HOA guidelines, but also a criminal offense. The reality of the situation hit her hard. She was now facing the possibility of hefty fines, legal action, and the public exposure of her years of deceit. The once loyal members of the HOA, who had silently endured her tyranny for so long, began whispering amongst themselves, their tones shifting from wary admiration to outright disdain. A few even muttered that it might be time to vote her out of her self-appointed position. I watched the entire unfolding drama with a sense of bittersweet satisfaction. This was more than just a petty act of revenge, it was poetic justice. Karen, the woman who had spent years imposing her arbitrary rules and bullying her neighbors, was now left with nothing but the bitter taste of her own hypocrisy. As the city inspector took detailed notes and the water department officials arrived to assess the damage, Karen tried one last desperate attempt to salvage her dignity, blaming everything on misunderstandings and even claiming that her late husband or the previous homeowner was to blame. But it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable, and as the inspector concluded that there was no immediate criminal charge, just a hefty civil dispute, the reality set in for everyone in the room. The rest of the day was a blur of paperwork, whispered conversations, and the gradual realization that the era of Karen's tyrannical rule was coming to an end. Neighbors who had once cowered under her incessant fines and baseless complaints now looked at her with new eyes, eyes that saw her not as a guardian of community standards, but as a bully who had finally been brought to justice. As I stood on my porch later that evening, enjoying a quiet beer with Matt and watching the last of the soapy foam recede, I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The neighborhood, once burdened by Karen's overbearing presence, was now lighter, freer, and more united than ever before. That night, as I reflected on the events of the day, I couldn't help but marvel at how a simple act of soap sabotage had unraveled a web of deceit and tyranny. The story of that Sudsy morning became a turning point, not just for me, but for the entire community. It was a reminder that sometimes, standing up to an overbearing authority, no matter how petty the offense, can lead to monumental change. And as for Karen, she was left standing in the midst of her ruined lawn, a stark symbol of what happens when power is abused and karma comes knocking at your door. In the end, I learned that every bubble, every soapy swirl, carried with it a lesson, that even in the most mundane settings, justice can be served in the most unexpected and delightfully messy ways. And while I'll never forget the day my pool turned into a giant bubble bath, I'm grateful that it paved the way for a more harmonious, honest, and collectively empowered neighborhood.